I came home earlier than expected to our house in Brookfield, Ohio, arms full of grocery bags from the small market on West Cedar Avenue where I had picked up Lauren's favorite brand of imported pasta and the dark roast coffee she insists tastes better than anything else. And as I nudged the door shut with my foot and stepped quietly into the hallway, I heard her voice drifting from the living room, bright and amused, the kind of laugh she used to reserve for me when we were younger, and everything still felt uncomplicated. I was about to call out to let her know I was home when I heard my name, not spoken with warmth or affection, but dropped casually into a sentence that made my stomach tighten. She was on the phone with her friend, talking about marriage as if it were some competitive sport, saying that husbands should constantly prove themselves because love is not a guarantee, that if a man stops earning affection, he does not deserve it. And then she laughed again, light and dismissive, as if the entire concept of loyalty was naive. I stood there frozen in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the living room, plastic grocery bags cutting into my fingers, listening as she explained that men get comfortable and think they are safe once the vows are exchanged. And that was when she said my name, saying that I try hard, but even I could not afford to slack off because she would never settle for feeling unappreciated. 12 years of marriage flashed through my mind in that moment. 12 years of working overtime at the plant outside Youngstown, so she could stay home when the kids were younger. 12 years of skip vacations because we were paying down the mortgage faster. 12 years of quietly taking on a heavier load whenever she felt overwhelmed. And suddenly all it felt like some endless audition instead of shared life. I remembered selling my old Mustang because she wanted something more practical, and using the money to renovate the kitchen she said would make her feel more at peace. I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed when she had that minor surgery 3 years ago and sleeping in an uncomfortable chair for 2 nights straight just so she would not wake up alone. And I remembered every anniversary gift I carefully chose because I thought marriage was about showing up consistently, not about competing for approval. As I stood there listening to her describe affection as something conditional, something that had to be constantly earned like points in a game, I felt a shift inside me that I cannot fully explain, not explosive anger, but a heavy, suffocating clarity, the kind that makes everything you believed about your relationship feel slightly tilted and unstable. I realized she did not see me as her partner walking beside her, but as someone performing, someone who needed to maintain a certain level of usefulness or charm to deserve basic emotional security, and that realization cut deeper than any insult ever could. My hands had gone numb from holding the bags, and one of them slipped slightly, the plastic rustling loud enough that she paused mid-sentence before lowering her voice, and I quickly set the groceries down on the kitchen counter, trying to steady my breathing while pretending I had just walked in when she finally noticed me and ended the call. Her expression was neutral, almost pleasant, as if nothing significant had been said, and I found myself studying her face, searching for the woman I thought I had built a life with, wondering when our marriage had quietly turned into a performance review that I did not know I was failing. Instead of confronting her that night, instead of walking back into the living room and telling her exactly what I had overheard in the hallway of our house in Brookfield, Ohio, I made a quiet decision that felt small in the moment but heavy with intention, a decision to stop performing for affection, as if I were still auditioning for the role of her husband after 12 years of marriage. And I carried that decision with me into the next morning like a private vow. I did not set my alarm 10 minutes early to brew her favorite dark roast coffee the way I had done almost every weekday for years. I did not warm her mug under hot water, so it would not cool too quickly in her hands. And I did not leave the small handwritten note beside it that usually said something simple about hoping she had a good day, because suddenly those gestures felt less like expressions of love and more like currency I was spending to maintain my position in her life. When Friday came around, I did not browse reservations for restaurants downtown in Crestview like I normally would, comparing reviews and checking which places had live music she liked. And I did not book a table at that little Italian spot she always posts about on social media, as if romance were something that simply appeared without planning. And I did not suggest we drive out to Lake Harmon for the weekend the way I had done countless times before, packing the car myself while she chose which dresses to bring for photos by the water. I stopped initiating physical affection too, stopped reaching for her hand while we watched television, stopped kissing the back of her neck when she was washing dishes, stopped wrapping my arm around her waist in the kitchen, and instead, I mirrored the emotional distance she had described so casually on that phone call, as if partnership were conditional and warmth had to be earned through continuous effort. It was not an angry withdrawal, not a dramatic silence meant to provoke, but a deliberate leveling of energy, a quiet recalibration of how much of myself I poured into the relationship. Because if love had to be earned, then I wanted to see what happened when I stopped competing for it and simply existed as I was. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner without making a show of it, handled the bills, mowed the lawn, and maintain the structure of our life without layering it in romantic extras. And the absence of those gestures felt louder to me than any argument could have. The house felt different, less charged with anticipation, less orchestrated around her comfort, and I noticed how quickly routine exposed imbalance when the extra effort disappeared. Each morning she poured her own coffee without comment at first. Each evening we sat a little farther apart on the couch, and I watched carefully without asking for reassurance, without filling the silence, because I wanted to understand whether affection in our marriage was truly reciprocal or if it had always depended on my willingness to prove myself worthy of it. I did not bring up the overheard conversation. I did not accuse or defend. I simply stepped back and allowed the dynamic she described to reveal itself in real time. And as the days passed, I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity settling in my chest, as if I were observing our marriage from the outside for the first time instead of desperately trying to sustain it through effort alone. For the first 2 weeks, Lauren barely reacted to the shift in me, and that almost hurt more than if she had confronted me outright, because it showed how accustomed she had become to my constant attentiveness, how predictable she believed my effort would remain no matter what changed beneath the surface. She assumed I was stressed from managing my construction firm, assumed the long hours and payroll meetings and site inspections were weighing on me more than usual, and she treated my emotional withdrawal like a temporary glitch rather than a deliberate choice. In the evening, she continued her routine without interruption, curling up on her side of the couch with her phone, casting a pale blue light across her face while she scrolled through social media, double-tapping photos, occasionally laughing softly at something on her screen, and I sat at the opposite end with a quiet stillness that felt foreign even to me. I kept my conversations short and neutral, answering questions about my day with measured simplicity, offering no elaboration, no invitation for deeper discussion, and when she spoke about hers, I listened politely but did not lean in, did not ask follow-up questions designed to show enthusiasm, did not amplify her stories the way I once had. I noticed how quickly the house began to feel different when I stopped filling every silence with reassurance or affection, how the absence of small gestures created a space that neither of us seemed eager to occupy. The kitchen no longer carried the easy rhythm of shared movement. We passed each other without brushing shoulders, without playful remarks, without the subtle touches that once signaled connection. She interpreted my restraint as fatigue at first, telling me I should rest more, suggesting that maybe I was overworking myself at the firm, and I nodded without correcting her assumption, because explaining the real reason would have required exposing the vulnerability I was still sorting through. I watched her expect me to return to my usual attentive self, as if affection were a default setting that could not be permanently altered, and that expectation revealed something uncomfortable, something that confirmed what I had felt in the hallway that day. She did not seem to notice that I had stopped initiating affection, stopped creating moments of intimacy, stopped carrying the emotional momentum of the relationship, and her lack of awareness exposed how one-sided our emotional labor had always been. The silence between us was not explosive or dramatic. It was gradual and thick, spreading through rooms like fog rolling in from a lake, soft at first and then impossible to ignore, settling into corners and lingering in the air long after. Conversations ended. I found myself observing rather than participating, measuring the distance that formed without my constant effort to bridge it, and each evening that passed without her reaching across the space between us felt like another quiet confirmation that what I had overheard was not a careless remark, but a reflection of how she truly viewed our marriage. As the days passed and the quiet distance between us settled into something undeniable, Lauren's indifference began to shift into something more deliberate, more strategic, and I could see the change the way she carried herself around me, as if she were trying to measure whether I would react the way I always had before. She started dressing up more intentionally for her girls' nights in downtown Fairmont, choosing outfits that were slightly more daring than usual, heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floors, perfume applied heavier than necessary, and she would linger in the doorway of the bedroom just long enough for me to notice, adjusting her earrings or smoothing down her dress while watching me from the corner of her eye. In the past, I would have complimented her immediately, would have asked where they were going, would have reminded her to text me when she got there safely, and would have felt that familiar tightening in my chest at the thought of other men looking at her. But this time I simply glanced up from whatever I was doing, nodded once, and returned to my own thoughts without commentary. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than any jealousy ever could have, and I saw it in the subtle stiffness of her posture when I did not ask questions or make remarks about how beautiful she looked, because she had expected a response, expected pursuit, expected some sign that I was still competing for her attention. Instead, I treated her outings as normal events, not as tests I needed to pass, and when she returned late smelling of perfume and wine, I did not interrogate her or sulk. I simply acknowledged her presence and continued with whatever I had been doing. She began making sarcastic remarks about how I was becoming boring, how I used to be more spontaneous, how maybe I was losing my spark now that I was so focused on work, and her tone carried that thin edge of provocation designed to trigger defensiveness. In the past, I would have rushed to defend myself, listing the responsibilities I carried at a construction firm, reminding her of the pressure of payroll and contracts and deadlines. But now I did not justify or argue. I responded calmly, sometimes with a simple shrug, sometimes with a quiet acknowledgement that people change, and the lack of emotional engagement seemed to frustrate her more than any heated disagreement would have. She escalated to small arguments about chores and communication, picking apart trivial things like the way I folded laundry or whether I'd taken the trash out early enough, framing them as signs that I was withdrawing or becoming inattentive, and I recognized the pattern clearly, an attempt to pull me back into dynamic where I would scramble to prove myself attentive and committed. I refused to chase her validation or defend myself beyond what was necessary, and instead I maintained a steady, even tone, refusing to let the conversation spiral into a familiar dance of accusation and reassurance. The more composed and indifferent I became, the more unsettled she looked, as if the power balance she had grown comfortable was quietly shifting beneath her feet, because for the first time in our marriage, she was not the one being pursued, not the one dictating the emotional tempo, and the realization that I was no longer auditioning for her approval seemed to disturb her in ways she did not know how to articulate. One night at dinner, after nearly 3 weeks of carefully measured distance and controlled restraint, Lauren finally set her fork down with sharp emotion than necessary and looked at me across the table with an expression that was equal parts irritation and confusion, as if she could no longer tolerate the quiet shift in our dynamic. The kitchen light cast soft shadows against the walls, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence that had become increasingly common between us, and she broke it by asking directly if I was angry with her. Her voice was not apologetic or concerned, but edged with impatience, as though my composure was inconveniencing her. I met her gaze steadily and told her I had been thinking about effort, choosing my words carefully and keeping my tone even, not accusatory, not emotional, simply reflective. I explained that I had started considering how much of our relationship had been built on constant output for me, how much energy I poured into planning, reassuring, initiating, smoothing over tensions, and maintaining the warmth of the room, and how I had begun to wonder what would remain if I stopped trying so hard to sustain everything. I did not raise my voice, did not reference a phone call I had overheard, did not accuse her of treating affection like something transactional. I simply described my thoughts as calmly as I could. She leaned back in her chair and let out a short, dismissive laugh that immediately tightened something in my chest, and she said my tone sounded dramatic, like I was turning nothing into something larger than it needed to be. She accused me of overreacting to stress, suggesting that I was projecting work pressure onto our marriage, and insisted that relationships naturally ebb and flow without needing to be analyzed so intensely. The way she framed it made it clear that in her mind I was the one responsible for restoring whatever imbalance existed, that my withdrawal was a malfunction I needed to correct rather than a reaction to something deeper. She did not pause to consider whether there might be truth in what I was expressing, did not reflect on her own role in shaping the atmosphere between us, and instead subtly positioned herself as the steady center, while I was portrayed as unstable or overly sensitive. As she spoke, I recognized a familiar pattern that had defined so much of our marriage, the expectation that I would adjust, apologize, clarify, or reassure until harmony was restored, while she remained the evaluator of whether my efforts were sufficient. There was no curiosity in her voice about how I felt, only frustration that I was no longer performing at the level she had grown accustomed to. I nodded slowly, letting her finish without interrupting, and when she stopped talking, I did not rush to defend myself or soften my stance. I simply told her I was not angry, only reflective, and that I believed effort should not be one-sided. If it was meant to last, she rolled her eyes slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried years of unspoken hierarchy within it, and changed the subject to something trivial, as if the conversation had already been resolved by her dismissal. In that moment, I felt something settle firmly inside me, not bitterness but clarity, because her reaction confirmed what I had suspected since that day in the hallway. She still believed I was obligated to restore balance, to pursue, to prove, while she reserved the right to evaluate whether I measured up, and instead of pushing harder or explaining myself further, I quietly recommitted to pulling back even more, determined to see how long the structure of our marriage could stand without my constant reinforcement. The dynamic shifted in a way neither of us could ignore the night she tried to rekindle intimacy and realized I was no longer the one closing the distance between us, because for the first time since I had stepped back emotionally, she reached across the space instead of waiting for me to do it. It happened on an ordinary evening when the house was quiet and the television was playing some forgettable show in the background, and she moved closer on the couch, her leg brushing against mine in a gesture that once would have immediately drawn me in. I felt the contact, felt the familiar warmth of her skin, But I did not respond instinctively the way I used to, did not wrap my arm around her waist or lean in to kiss her shoulder, and the hesitation was subtle yet unmistakable. She tried again later that night, standing closer to me in the kitchen while I rinsed the plate, her hand resting lightly on my back as if testing whether I would turn toward her, and when I simply finished what I was doing and stepped aside without escalating the moment, I saw the first flicker of confusion cross her face. There was no anger in me, no desire to punish her, only a steady commitment to no longer initiate affection out of obligation or fear of losing favor. When we went to bed, she reached for me under the covers in a way that felt slightly tentative, and I responded politely but without urgency, without that familiar eagerness that had always reassured her of her position in my life. A few days later, after several similar attempts that did not unfold the way she expected, she finally asked in a quieter tone than usual why we had grown distant, and there was a nervous edge in her voice that had not been there before. We were standing in the bedroom, the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains, and she looked at me as if waiting for a simple explanation that would allow her to categorize the situation and regain control of it. I met her gaze calmly and told her that I had simply stopped trying to earn something that should have been freely given, and I kept my voice steady so she would understand I was not lashing out, but stating a conclusion I had already reached internally. For a moment she did not respond, and in that silence I saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the certainty she usually carried, because my words placed her in the position I had occupied for years, the position of wondering whether affection was conditional and whether effort would be reciprocated. The uncertainty in her eyes was subtle but undeniable, and it revealed that she was experiencing the same emotional neglect she had once rationalized as normal, the same quiet questioning of worth that comes when affection feels earned rather than shared. She seemed unsettled not because I was cruel or dismissive, but because I was no longer competing for her approval, no longer filling every gap of reassurance. And in that space, she was forced to confront what it felt like to reach without immediately being met halfway. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening when she announced, almost too casually, that she had made reservations at a trendy Italian restaurant in Maplewood Heights, the kind of place with dim lighting and polished marble tables where we used to celebrate anniversaries and milestones, and I noticed immediately the effort she had put into the night before I even responded. She emerged from the bedroom wearing a dress she once saved for special occasions, a deep emerald color that contrasted with her skin and hugged her figure in a way she knew always caught my attention, her hair styled more carefully than usual, makeup applied with precision, perfume lingering in the hallway long after she stepped into the living room. The presentation was deliberate, curated, almost strategic, and I watched it with a calmness that surprised even me. Instead of complimenting her or expressing excitement, I asked her quietly what had changed, and the question seemed to land heavier than I intended, because she froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a small smile. She asked what I meant, and I clarified that I was curious why we were suddenly dressing up and going somewhere elaborate when for weeks we had barely spoken beyond necessary exchanges. The air between us tightened, and I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to interpret whether I was being sarcastic or sincere. She accused me almost immediately of punishing her, saying that my withdrawal had gone too far, that I was deliberately withholding affection to make a point, and her voice carried that familiar mix of frustration and disbelief, as if she genuinely could not understand how the shift had occurred without her consent. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish her explanation about how relationships require effort from both sides, how she had been trying to reconnect, how my indifference felt cold and unnecessary. When she finally paused, waiting for me to defend myself or apologize, I reminded her calmly of her own words about love being conditional, about husbands needing to constantly prove themselves to deserve affection, and I told her that I had only adjusted the rules she created. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had, because for the first time the philosophy she once expressed so confidently was being reflected back at her, without hostility, without exaggeration, simply applied evenly. I explained that if love had to be earned, then I had stepped back from the competition, and if affection was something to be evaluated, then I had stopped volunteering for assessment. I was not angry, I told her. I was simply operating within the framework she described, and I had decided to see what our marriage looked like without me constantly proving my worth. Watching her struggle to defend that philosophy was the moment everything shifted, because she attempted to soften her original stance, saying she had not meant it that way, that it had been taken out of context. But the certainty she once carried was gone. Her confidence wavered as she realized that the dynamic had reversed, that she was now the one trying to initiate, trying to impress, try to restore warmth that no longer flowed automatically from me. In her eyes, I saw not just frustration, but genuine uncertainty, the recognition that the power balance had flipped, and for the first time since that afternoon in the hallway, I understood that she could feel the weight of conditional love pressing back against her in a way she could no longer ignore. In the final week, after the conversation about the restaurant in Maplewood Heights had stripped away the last layer of denial between us, Lauren shifted from confrontation to damage control with a sudden urgency that felt almost desperate, and the change in her behavior was unmistakable. She began leaving small gestures scattered throughout the house, as if they were offerings meant to coax me back into the role I had quietly abandoned. Brewing coffee for me in the mornings, even though she never used to wake before I did, texting me during the day with messages that felt carefully worded and unusually soft, and touching my arm when she passed me in the hallway in a way that carried hesitation rather than entitlement. There was a deliberate sweetness in her tone, a measured gentleness in her words, and I could see how hard she was trying to recalibrate the dynamic now that she understood the shift was not temporary. A few nights later, she suggested we take an expensive trip to Santa Rosa Coast, describing oceanfront views and private dinners on the beach as if geography could undo the structural imbalance that had taken years to build, and she spoke about it with an eagerness that might have impressed me months earlier. She framed it as a reset, as time away from stress, as an opportunity to reconnect without distractions. But I listened carefully and felt no pull toward the idea, because I understood that vacations cannot fix a foundation built on transactions. I told her calmly that no destination, no resort, no curated sunset dinner could restore something that had been eroded by conditional affection, and my words were not harsh but steady, spoken with a clarity that had slowly solidified inside me over the past month. That night, the air in our bedroom felt heavier than it ever had before, and while she sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly in her lap, I opened a closet and pulled down a suitcase that had not been used in over a year. I packed methodically, folding clothes with quiet precision, placing them inside without rushing, without dramatic gestures, because this decision had not been made in anger but in understanding. She watched me the entire time, her composure unraveling in small increments, and when she finally spoke, her voice was no longer confident or defensive but fragile, almost childlike, as she whispered that she never meant for me to stop loving her. I paused for a moment, not because I doubted myself, but because I recognized the truth in her fear, and I told her that love cannot survive as a performance, that it cannot thrive when one person is constantly trying to earn what should be given freely, and that I had not stopped loving her out of spite, but out of exhaustion. I explained that when affection becomes conditional, something fundamental breaks, and once someone steps out of competition, the silence that follows reveals everything that was previously hidden by effort. 7 years earlier, we had bought that house for $420,000, signing papers with hands intertwined, and believing we were building something permanent, something stable, something rooted in partnership rather than evaluation, and as I zipped the suitcase closed, I felt the weight of that memory settle into something final. She remained seated on the edge of the bed, eyes glossy, shoulders trembling slightly, but she did not move to stop me, because deep down she understood that this was not a dramatic gesture meant to provoke reassurance. When I walked out of the house that night, closing the door softly behind me, I left her alone with the realization that once someone stops fighting to earn love, the silence that replaces the effort does not fade away. It settles permanently, and no amount of late gestures can convince it to leave.